Okay, welcome everyone to our July webinar in the OBCI webinar series. If you are new to OBCI and to our webinar series, I just want to briefly introduce who we are. The Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative is a network of organizations throughout the state of Ohio and regionally working together to advance bird conservation. So that group of organizations includes everyone from state and federal wildlife agencies to universities, county and city metro park systems, as well as museums, nature centers, and NGOs throughout the region. And so we're always looking for new organizations to join the network. So if you are joining us today representing an organization, either in Ohio or within the greater region, please reach out to us or go to our website, obcinet.org, to learn more about our work. We've been doing these webinars every other month so far this year, and our next webinar is going to be on September 20th. And we will be joined by Carrie Morrow from Columbus and Franklin County Metro Parks. She's going to be talking about a lot of the restoration work that they've been doing within the park system. Registration is already open for that webinar, so please go to our website to learn more about it and to sign up. Just some brief housekeeping. We do have the Q&A function turned on for today, so at any point during today's presentation, if you think of questions that you would like to ask our presenter, go ahead and use that Q&A button and enter your question in the chat in the box there. We've turned on the upvote functionality, so if you see a question come up that you were thinking about that somebody's already asked, you can upvote that and that will move it to the top of the queue. If you're not able to join for the entirety of today's program, you can watch recordings of it at any given time. All of our past webinars are on our website. They're indexed on our website. So under the resources tab, you'll find a link for webinars. On that page, you can sign up for our newsletter to get notified about upcoming programs, register for specific events that we have coming up. So I already mentioned that we have the webinar with Carrie Morrow in September. But on that page, you can also access recordings to all of the past webinars that we've done. We've done dozens of them over the years. Each of those recordings link to our YouTube channel, so you can go directly there as well to find not only about the webinars that we do, but if we've been featured on local news or workshops that we've done, a lot of that is indexed on our YouTube channel as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce today's presentation, and that is using GPS tracking to fill knowledge gaps in the full annual cycle of an elusive aerial insectivore in steep decline. Our presenter today is Aaron Skinner, who I'm really excited to introduce. Aaron holds a Master's of Science from The Ohio State University, where he conducted research on the full annual cycle of eastern whippoorwills in Dr. Chris Tonner's lab. He recently worked as a Fulbright student researcher, conducting a pilot season in Colombia regarding more bird-friendly approaches to cattle ranching. He will continue this research for his PhD at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver starting this fall. And so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Aaron, who's going to present today's program on eastern whippoorwills.
That I conducted during my master's, and basically I was trying to fill in knowledge gaps in the full annual cycle of the eastern whippoorwill. All right, so the eastern whippoorwill is both a neotropical migrant and an aerial insectivore, which are two groups of birds that are declining precipitously. Here in the top right, you can see the reduction in biomass registered at using weather stations in neotropical migrants. So just in about 10 years, we've had a 10% reduction in biomass in neotropical migrants. And whippoorwills are also aerial insectivores, which is actually the group of birds that's experienced the most precipitous declines. If you can follow my cursor here, hopefully you guys can see that. This pink line here represents aerial insectivores, which have experienced about almost 60% declines in this 50-year period here. And so the star of today's show is the eastern whippoorwill, which is a cryptic, which means well camouflaged, and nocturnal nightjar. And so, as you guys can probably imagine, a super well camouflaged bird that's only out at night is going to be pretty difficult to study. However, on the breeding grounds, this species is extremely vocal. Their Latin name is actually Antrostomus vociferus, and so they are super vocal. And I'm just going to play their song here, which is really an iconic song of eastern hardwood forests, as I'm sure a lot of you guys know. And so it's really a lovely song, and a song that I definitely grew to appreciate. And as long as you don't have one right outside your window as you're trying to go to sleep or something like that, it's really, really awesome. But as you can imagine, these birds are singing all the time on the breeding grounds, and that helps alert biologists to their presence, which makes them much easier to study on the breeding grounds. But on the non-breeding grounds and the rest of the annual cycle, this species is essentially non-vocal. They might give a little grunt or something here or there, but they're not, producing that beautiful song. And so it's been really hard to study this species outside of the breeding grounds. And that's why there's a huge research bias towards the breeding grounds for this species and many other neotropical migrants, especially those that are difficult to detect outside of the breeding grounds. So I want to take a moment to talk about the full annual cycle approach to conservation. I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with a figure like this down here in the bottom left that shows kind of the 4 major phases of the annual cycle for a migratory bird, but I'll walk through it. It's currently the end of July, so whippoorwills and our neotropical migrants are up here on the breeding grounds, and as things start to get a little bit colder, our whippoorwills and our Florida retirees are going to pack up their suitcases and head south on autumn migration. And I've paused the animation here on the overwintering grounds because all neotropical migrants really spend the majority of the annual cycle on the overwintering grounds. Most of the time it's at least 6 months. In some species, it's up to 8 months of the year they're actually spending on the wintering grounds. And then they're gonna head back north to the breeding grounds once again. And so I want to highlight that events outside of the breeding season can actually impact the number of individuals and that return to the breeding grounds and the condition that those individuals return in. And so this can have really big impacts for how successful the breeding season is for these individuals. And now shifting your focus up here to this figure on the top right, this figure shows the percent change in population trends per year, where these reddish tones are steeper declines, and these blue tones are actually increases in population trends in the eastern whippoorwill over the last 50 years. And so the 2 things I want to highlight here are that these are clearly very non-uniform and heterogeneous, right? You can see areas where there's steep declines right next to areas where there's actually increases in these estimated population trends. But overall, whippoorwills are declining tremendously. They've lost over 70% of their populations in the last 50 years. So anyways, when you see a figure like this that's showing very heterogeneous population trends, there's essentially two options. One is that events on the breeding grounds are causing these different population trends. So, for example, something in Missouri is causing this population to decline heavily, and something else in Arkansas is actually allowing this population to flourish and increase. Or the other option is that these distinct breeding populations are remaining cohesive throughout the full annual cycle, and events in other phases of the annual cycle are responsible for these differential population trends that we actually measure on the breeding grounds when migratory birds are most easily detected because they are singing. And so if that wasn't super clear yet, I'm going to explain that again with another example that will hopefully clarify everything a little bit further. I'm just going to take 1 sec to check the chat and make sure. Yeah, okay, nothing.
Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't any issues with, the presentation or anything like that.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, so I'm just going to illustrate this again here with an example in the golden wing warbler. This figure here is showing two regions with different population trends. So we have our Great Lakes region here in red, and our Appalachian population here in yellow or gold. And these black lines here show the respective population trends. So you can see that the Great Lakes population has been relatively stable, while the Appalachian population has really taken a nosedive since the 1960s. And each one of these lines here connects a single individual golden wing warbler's breeding location with their wintering location. And so what I want to highlight here is that the Great Lakes population is solely wintering in Central America, and the Appalachian population is wintering in northern South America. And so you could say that these breeding populations are remaining cohesive throughout the full annual cycle, and they're not mixing with other breeding populations on the wintering grounds. And so the really damning evidence here that it's events outside of the breeding season that are determining these population trends is that the deforestation rates on the wintering grounds, which are shown here, it's kind of this background color, and this stair step here, that's showing the deforestation, or I guess that's actually the amount of forest left, trends in their respective wintering grounds. And you can see there's really high correlations between the population trends that we observe on the breeding grounds and the deforestation rates on the wintering grounds. And so this really brings us to an important concept here that's going to be central to the talk here, which is migratory connectivity, which is a standardized metric of population cohesion throughout the annual cycle. And so just again, another example here, the rose-breasted grosbeak has high migratory connectivity or strong migratory connectivity. And you can see that these populations are remaining cohesive and they're not mixing throughout the annual cycle, whereas the green-winged teal, on the other hand, is exhibiting weak migratory connectivity or low migratory connectivity, and individuals are mixing extensively throughout the full annual cycle. And it's really important for conservation planning to understand which, on this spectrum where a given species lies. And so I just kind of exhibited or showed with that past example in the golden wing warblers, why strong migratory connectivity can be really important for conservation. But low migratory connectivity, like the case of the green-winged teal, can also be super important. And that's because it can help identify important areas for conservation action. So here, all these individuals from across the entire breeding range are migrating and overwintering around the Gulf of Mexico. And so investing conservation dollars in the Gulf Coast could be really important for this species, or, a really good bang for your buck. Okay, so these broad scale distributional patterns are key to understanding population limitation throughout the full annual cycle, but an understanding of the fine scale habitat and space use during the more stationary periods of the annual cycle is also really important. And so in the case of the wintering grounds, we don't know very much about super basic life history information, like what habitats birds are using outside of the breeding season. And so in the case of the whippoorwill, there was a recent study by Chris Tonra, who was actually my advisor at Ohio State. And that was pretty much the first study, even getting at some of this really basic information for the whippoorwill in the core of their wintering range. And so essentially what this figure shows here, these are the wintering home ranges of 11 whippoorwills that were tagged in Ohio. And these colors represent the different land covers. Here's the key down here: forest, scrub, open habitat, and developed, that the whippoorwills were using. And sorry, just so we're all on the same page here, a home range is basically just the area in which an animal lives and moves on a regular basis. And so anyways, you can see here for the whippoorwill that forest is super important. There were 3 individuals out of 11 that had only forest in their home range. But this was a very small study, right? Just 11 individuals and all from one site. And so there's a clear need to expand the number of individuals and the areas where tags were deployed to see if these patterns are consistent across all of the breeding range. And another advantage of expanding the sample size here is you can really start to more robustly test hypotheses. And one particular hypothesis that I'm going to focus on today that we were very interested in was how the conversion of forest to agriculture impacted space use in this species. And so we couldn't directly measure insects on the wintering grounds, but one potential mechanism was that the negative effects of agriculture are causing insect populations to decline. And so that's actually going to increase the amount of space that's required for a whippoorwill to meet their metabolic needs. So they'll have to travel further and exploit more habitat to get the same number of insects that they need to meet their metabolic needs, was our hypothesis. Okay, and now just to more formally state our objectives here, the overarching objective of this research was to elucidate basic non-breeding season ecology in the eastern whippoorwill. Our first objective was to calculate migratory connectivity, identify migratory routes, important stopover locations, and core wintering areas. Our second objective was to understand how overlap in time and space changes throughout migration. And I haven't really talked too much about that piece yet, but I'll explain it here in the coming slides. And then our third objective was to explore predictors of home range size across multiple spatial scales. And that was that hypothesis that I just mentioned there. So we were particularly interested in agriculture's effect on space use. So as I mentioned, though, whippoorwills are nocturnal and cryptic. So how are we, and non-vocal during the outside of the breeding season. So how are we going to achieve these objectives with a species that's been so challenging to study outside of the breeding season in the past? And the miniaturization of GPS technology has been revolutionary for the study of birds. These are, we used archival GPS tags that weigh about 1 gram and can go on birds as small as 20 grams. And they take GPS locations that are precise to between 5 and 10 meter accuracy. And I just wanted to share this quick anecdote. I was recently in the Andes in a Paramo site with some colleagues, and they were putting what are called life tags on hummingbirds. And so these are tags that actually have a small solar panel on them, and hummingbirds, they were only tagging the largest hummingbirds, which were about up to about 8 grams. And in theory, these tags are going to last forever. And they'll, or until the bird dies, and they'll provide a lifetime of movement data on these hummingbirds. So it's incredible to see how fast the technology is really advancing. And we bought these tags in 2019, and that's where we're at now in 2022. So it's tough to keep up with all the technological advances. And then the one downside of these tags is that they must be recovered to acquire the data. So the data is archived on these tags, and then the scientists must go out and try to recapture these birds to get the data. And so we deployed these tags in 2017 and 2019. And we programmed them to take a GPS location every 4th or 5th day from August to April. These circles here show our deployment sites. We had 5 breeding areas across the Midwestern United States. And in the end, we ended up with data from 52 tags across these 2 deployment years. So I'm going to start sharing some results here. These blue pixels represent the core wintering areas from our 5 breeding sites, which are shown here at the top of each panel. And the dots represent an individual wintering location from an individual from that breeding site. And panel F here down on the bottom shows the core wintering area for all breeding sites combined, and here are all 52 wintering locations. And so basically, you can see there's a ton of overlap in where these different breeding populations are wintering, right? It's pretty much all concentrated in southern Mexico and northern Central America. And so if we think back to our standardized measure of population cohesion, migratory connectivity, this would be weak or low migratory connectivity because individuals from across the breeding range are coming to the same area and intermixing in other phases of the annual cycle. The second part of our first objective here was to identify key stopover regions. And a stopover is basically just a rest and refueling stop during migration for a migratory bird. And so this map here shows the migratory tracks of all 52 whippoorwills. And these inflection points, hopefully you guys can see my cursor again, are where the tags actually took a point, right? So we have, these same 5 breeding sites that I just mentioned on the previous slide. And then we have the GPS locations where the tags took a point, and essentially all we've done here is connect the dots. And so out of these 52 birds, we recorded 21 birds that stopped over. These circles here represent the first stopover location, and these red diamonds represent an individual that stopped over twice. So for example, this individual from Northern Ohio stopped over once here and then stopped over a second time here. And the size of these icons represent the duration of the stopover. And again, basically to record a stopover, we had to have 2 GPS locations, 2 consecutive GPS locations in the same site. So there could have been stopovers that were a lot shorter. The minimum time or duration that we were able to detect was 4 days, just due to that sampling schedule that I mentioned earlier. And so I want to highlight this region, which we identified as a key stopover region, because 12 out of the 21 individuals stopped over here. And basically this was the Ozarks Plateau, the Ouachita Mountains, and the prairies and forests of Eastern Texas. So again, this could be a really important area to invest conservation dollars, because whippoorwills are using these areas to rest and refuel on their migratory journey. All right, moving on to objective 2 here. This was kind of the objective that I hadn't explained yet, so I'm going to take a minute to explain this concept a little bit further. It's migratory spatiotemporal overlap is extremely similar to the concept of migratory connectivity. The main difference is that it takes into account the timing or the temporal component of movement, which is not very relevant for birds during the stationary periods, right? So during breeding and during wintering, birds are in theory not relocating very much. Whereas during migration, birds are moving a lot, and the timing of migration can vary a ton. So that's why it's important to take into account the timing of movement as well here. And so I'm going to explain through this figure here. These bigger circles represent breeding population, and these small circles represent individuals from a given breeding population. And essentially this is a snapshot in time here. So, let's say we have fall migration coming up. Let's say this is, on September 30th, where individuals are. And you can see in this example of low spatiotemporal overlap, there's no mixing, there's no overlap of these distinct populations, right? And so that's low overlap in space and time, or to connect it back to our migratory connectivity concept, this would be high migratory connectivity. In this example here, you can see that individuals are completely intermixed on migration. And so this would be super low migratory connectivity because there's high spatiotemporal overlap. So they're kind of inverses of each other. And I'm going to be using the spatiotemporal overlap terminology here going forward when I'm talking about migration. So in the eastern whippoorwill, this figure here shows the latitudinal progression of migration. Here on the y-axis, you can see we have latitude as time advances, as migration advances. So here on the x-axis here, we have date. So I'm just going to take a random individual here to serve as an example. This individual here, this purple line, an individual from Northern Ohio, started migration very early, right? You can see September 1st, started migrating south. Here they stopped over for a few days, and then they continued their migratory journey. I'm only showing latitude on this figure because there was essentially negligible differences in longitude as migration progressed. And that's because individuals avoided the Gulf of Mexico, right? So if you think back to that figure with the migratory tracks, all birds kind of steered west of the Gulf of Mexico and therefore converged on the same longitude, basically. So latitude was much more variable and important. So the key takeaway here is that in these first 2 weeks of October, you can see that essentially all these birds are converging in time and space in both that region that I highlighted, the key stopover region, and then also as birds are rounding the Gulf of Mexico. And so this resulted in high overlap in time and space, high spatiotemporal overlap. And then this figure here on the right, I just thought it was, really impactful. This is a snapshot in time, October 5th to be exact. Each one of these dots represents an individual whippoorwill, their location on October 5th. And so individuals starting as far as 1,000 kilometers apart on the breeding grounds, that was about the distance from between our furthest sites, southern Missouri and northern Wisconsin, on October 5th, we're an average of 350 kilometers apart. So that's what I mean. These individuals are all coming together in time and space. I also want to bring your all's attention to this blue cross here. This is the average location of individuals on this date, and it was about 150 kilometers east of Dallas. And so I just threw up on the map here these 4 major urban centers: Dallas, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio. And these individuals were all traversing right through this, major urban gauntlet. And so that could be another area that's really important to think about for whippoorwill conservation. And so I just mentioned these 4, mega urban centers. And I think it's really important to think about because anthropogenic structures result in lots of mortality for birds, especially during migration. And the biggest threat are buildings, accounting for over 340 million deaths annually in birds. And so a lot of what happens is that birds are actually disoriented by anthropogenic light, and they're actually attracted to excessive light, especially on migration. And so this figure here in the middle here shows the amount of anthropogenic light at night in the United States. And I have listed the top 3 offenders of light pollution. So number 1 is Chicago, number 2 is Houston, and number 3 is Dallas in the entire United States. And so, just thinking back to that previous map, that's right where these birds are traversing through the middle of these, 2 omega light polluters of Houston and Dallas. And then finally, I just want to highlight this. One measure that's being used to combat light pollution are these lights out campaigns. And essentially, they're just encouraging businesses and cities to turn off their lights at night. You can see here this dark skyline And that's the idea behind these initiatives. And you can also see that there's specific dates that they're asking cities and businesses to turn off their lights. And I think, I think that just basically gets back to human nature. We can only do things for so much time. It's way more of an ask if we say turn off your lights all year round. So identifying these periods that are super critical for when the largest number of birds are going to be passing through a given area is really important. And so, I think that's part of the benefit of our study, was that we really identified a region and a time period that's super important for, targeting lights out initiatives and initiatives of that nature. And so I just want to take a brief related tangent here to highlight this super cool website and program called Birdcast that was created by Benjamin Van Doren and colleagues. And it's really cool for birders. So I'm sure a lot of you guys already know of it, but maybe it'll be a new tip for a few who don't. And essentially using that radar technology that I mentioned on the very first slide of the entire presentation, we're able to forecast the number of birds that are predicted to migrate to a certain area each day. And so I think, if I'm not mistaken, it only goes about 3 days in advance. But so let's say the night of April 24th, you hop on and you can look and see what migrate, or the night of April 25th, excuse me, you can see what predicted migration is supposed to look like for that night. And you might decide, oh, wow, I definitely got to get out and go birding tomorrow because there's going to be a lot of migration in my area, or ooh, not a lot of new birds coming through, so maybe it's not worth it. But obviously this technology and this tool is also super important for coming up with these lights out initiatives across species, right? And so I listed the link here, and Matt, maybe you can help distribute these slides to anyone that's interested, or at least the few links that I'm going to have throughout the presentation here at the end. Okay, so that's kind of the end of these first two objectives. And if anyone is interested in reading more, this research was recently published in Diversity in Distributions. And again, here's the link for that if anyone is interested in reading in more detail about what exactly was done. And so now, switching gears from this continental scale down to a much finer scale, what's actually happening in the stationary wintering period for these birds. And just to give you an idea of scale here, this white circle around these GPS locations, this was a 500-meter buffer that we put around the centroids of the home ranges that we calculated. So I'm gonna just walk through one example of how we go from these raw GPS locations and satellite imagery, which you can see in the top right-hand corner here, to a home range and the associated land cover. So essentially, these are the raw GPS locations, and we use we use autocorrelated kernel density estimation to come up with a home range estimate, or essentially just a polygon around the area that is most heavily utilized by a bird. And so I should say this is the same individual here in all three of these panels. And then we digitized the land cover. So essentially going from this satellite imagery to these land cover classes that we can then use for further analysis. And we digitize the land cover both in the home range, which you can see here is this black polygon for this individual, and in that site, which is the 500-meter buffer around the home range. And so our goal here was to understand variation in home range size. And so we organized our predictor variables across 3 spatial scales, 2 of which I just talked about, the home range and the site. And then we also included variables at the geographic scale. So that included latitude, longitude, distance to the nearest coast, and ecoregion, which are essentially these broad scale habitat types like humid forest, North American desert, mangroves, so on and so forth. And then at the scale of the site and the home range, we used the same composition and configuration metrics, just at these 2 different scales, right? So that included percent forest, agriculture, and scrub. As I said, we were super interested in agriculture, so we also included the presence and absence of agriculture. And then edge, which was a proxy for fragmentation, or essentially how heterogeneous the area of question is. So in this figure here, these colors represent the proportion of the land cover that was found in either the home range or the site. And as you can see, forest was the dominant land cover that these birds were using. There was forest in every single home range we looked at. 9 out of 25 birds only had forest in their home range, and we had potential evidence for selection for forest, where birds utilize forest in the home range at a greater proportion than what was available to them at the scale of the site. So you can kind of visualize that here, comparing the size of this green bar to this green bar at the site. So this figure here shows the model averaged parameter estimates for and their confidence intervals, which the confidence intervals essentially show the accuracy of the parameter estimates for the predictors of home range size, which I just mentioned. So the predictors are down here on the x-axis, right? You remember we talked about edge, percent forest, the presence of agriculture, so on and so forth. And basically the way this figure can be interpreted is if these points and the confidence intervals are above 0, that suggests that there's a positive impact of the given variable on home range size. And if they're below this line, that suggests that there's a negative impact on home range size. And so I'll explain that more with some specific examples here. And I want to just mention, I didn't include any of the variables at the geographic scale because none of them turned out to be important predictors of home range size in our birds. So I've highlighted in here in red the parameter estimates that don't overlap 0. And essentially that's a common way to identify the important variables, because if the confidence interval overlaps 0, it's essentially saying that there's a chance that that parameter has a 0 impact on home range size, or it has no impact on home range size, and therefore it's not important. So I'm going to start here on the left with ruggedness, which I haven't talked about yet. This was just used to standardize home range size across sites of different terrain ruggedness. So it was really just a control variable. I'm not going to talk about it anymore right now, but I'm happy to receive any questions on this later. Edge, you can see the amount of edge at the site here. This teal color represents the site and the orange represents the home range, was important. And so the way that I would say this is that greater amounts of edge or fragmentation or heterogeneity in the site resulted in larger home ranges. Conversely, greater amounts of forest in the site resulted in smaller home ranges, and the presence of agriculture in the home range resulted in larger home ranges. And so I want to briefly talk about a few conclusions here from this piece. So we saw that the conversion of forests to agriculture increased space use in whippoorwills. And this figure here shows the dynamic nature of land use change in the core of the whippoorwill wintering range. These blue dots represent reforestation, areas of reforestation, and these red dots represent areas of deforestation, and the size represents how the rate of deforestation or reforestation, basically. And so if you guys think back to those blue panels that showed the core wintering areas, there's a deforestation hotspot right in the core of the whippoorwill wintering range here in southern Mexico and northern Central America. So that's potentially problematic, but again, there's all this reforestation as well. And so, we're losing primary forest and we're gaining secondary forest, and we don't really have any idea about the value of primary versus secondary forest for the whippoorwill, because these satellite images, we couldn't differentiate that. So, that's an area of future research. And then kind of further extrapolating, I wanted to just float this as a potential impact of this increased space use, right? So this land use change leads to increased space use. As whippoorwills require more space, it's possible that there's more competition between individuals. Maybe these home ranges are overlapping more and there's actually increased competition. And that could potentially lead to decreased carrying capacity for a habitat of a given size or decreased body condition. And just a few examples from the literature here to support this. On the x-axis here, we have density of birds, which can be thought of as an index of competition. And you can see that as competition increases, apparent annual survival of these birds decreased. And similarly, as the quality of habitat decreases, there were fewer individual grizzly bears in this instance that were able to be supported in a given habitat. So you might think of, a habitat with more competition as being a lower quality habitat, and thus it might be able to support fewer individuals. Definitely kind of extrapolating here at this point. Okay, and now trying to tie everything together here, and what does all this mean for the declining whippoorwill? So remembering back to our first two objectives, we saw high spatiotemporal overlap, or high overlap in space and time outside of the breeding season. And so this suggests that events outside of the breeding season are going to impact individuals from across the breeding range. And so this is kind of a double-edged sword, and it's a conservation challenge and a conservation opportunity. It's a conservation challenge because, like I just pointed out, there's a deforestation hotspot right in the core of the whippoorwill wintering range. So individuals from across the breeding range are going to this pretty small contained area on the wintering grounds, and there just happens to be a deforestation hotspot right there. So that's, clearly a challenge. But on the other hand, conservation measures that are put in place are also going to, outside of the breeding season, are going to impact individuals from across the entire breeding range. So I already talked a little bit about the Lights Out initiative, and, targeting those initiatives, for example, in Texas and during those key dates that I mentioned, that's going to positively impact individuals from across the breeding range. So kind of a double-edged sword there. And so back to our map of differential population trends, those blues and reds that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, this finding doesn't really help explain the variation in the breeding grounds population trends, or at least we can say that events outside of the breeding grounds are probably not responsible for the differential population trends we observed on the breeding grounds. But we had low migratory connectivity. And so as I mentioned at the beginning, that's going to point to key areas to invest conservation dollars, right? So I would recommend focusing conservation efforts on that key stopover region in the Ozarks Plateau and the Ouachita Mountains, the areas of high overlap in space and time on migration in eastern Texas, and then the core wintering area in southern Mexico and northern Central America to focus our conservation efforts for the whippoorwill, at least if we're thinking about non-breeding season conservation measures. And then I want to just end on this figure here. I always thought it was really powerful, and I think it's kind of my best guess for what's going on in the case of the whippoorwill here. So these three circles represent three distinct breeding populations that are experiencing different population trends, just like the whippoorwill was, right? We have some areas that are declining precipitously, some that are about neutral, some that are actually increasing. And they all share a common wintering ground, just like the whippoorwill does. And the events on the wintering grounds are overall slightly negative. And so that's why you see that same slightly negative impact that's the same for all three of these distinct breeding populations, right? And so what's really determining those differential population trends is the events on the breeding grounds. You know, something is allowing for this green population to have super productive breeding season and you know, really high recruitment, and they're ending up with a net positive population trend. And in this case, it's negative, and in this case, it's about neutral. But I think the key point here is that it's a combination of events that are occurring in both, you know, throughout the full annual cycle in both the breeding and the wintering grounds that result in the overall trends that we measure on the breeding grounds. So yeah, that's kind of my best guess for what's going on with the whippoorwill, and I'll leave it with that. I think I went way over my time limit, but hopefully we have at least a few minutes for questions. And let's see. I want to acknowledge my committee members, especially my advisor, Chris Tonra, other collaborators on this project, lab mates and other faculty members at the Ohio State University, and all the folks that helped with land access. And happy to take any questions if there's still time. Sorry for blabbing on for so long there.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks so much, Aaron. No worries about the time. This is one of, if not my favorite group of birds. So, you know, I could sit here all day and listen to talks about nightjars and whippoorwills. And, you know, my mind is already racing. I know we've talked about it already quite a bit, and I have a few more questions for you, but I know we have some in the Q&A. There's at least one there now. So I'll encourage you at this time, if you have any questions for Aaron, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. But we have one in there right now, and Keith asks if the information for the topography, your spatial data, like the amount of forest and agriculture, were already available to you, or was that something that you did as a part of the research for this study?
Yeah, great question, Keith. So there are publicly available land cover databases that exist for this region. But we ended up manually digitizing all the land cover, which I can say was a royal pain in my ass for a couple weeks. And that was just because we pulled in some of those publicly available databases, and generally the resolution wasn't necessarily high enough, right? So some of these home ranges were really small, only, less than 1 hectare. And if you're thinking about land cover databases with either 30 by 30 pixels or 100 by 100 pixels, that might be 1 or 2 pixels that fit into a home range, or 10 pixels in the entire site that, that site scale that we were looking at. And so it wasn't at the spatial resolution that we needed. And also most of the land cover databases were not up to date. With the Google Earth imagery, we were really able to get the land cover that corresponded to when the whippoorwills were actually there most of the time, or within a year or two. Most of the time there was an image available for 2019 or 2020, or so we were able to get the land cover that really reflected when those GPS points were taken. And so we manually digitized all that land cover.
Yeah, having done a lot of that in my career in the past, I know what you went through to do that, and it can be fun if you're that type of person, but it can be a real drag too. But that's cool that those aerial images are available for you to work with. Let's see, I think we have another question here for you. So Bill asks if there are any specific conservation or environmental groups focused on nightjars and undertaking conservation efforts in the identified key geographic areas that you pointed out.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm really only familiar with one group that's really focusing on nightjars, and Matt might be a better person to answer this, but there's a group called the Nightjar Survey Network, and I think they're only focused on the breeding grounds, though, if I'm not mistaken. So they might have groups working in those regions in Texas, or maybe in the area that I indicated for stopover, but I'm not aware of any groups down in Central America and Mexico that are specifically focused on nightjars, and that does not at all mean that they don't exist. I haven't really had an opportunity to try to implement any of these conservation measures or whatever, so I haven't actually reached out, but maybe Matt has a better idea if of other groups that are working in those regions.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly groups who are working on sort of broader conservation efforts for birds. So the Nightjar Survey Network kind of functions a little bit like an actual network, a collaborative. So there are multiple organizations kind of within that structure that work together, and it functions a little bit more as a working group. So there are some local groups throughout Central America working on some things, but not really specifically for nightjars, I would say. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity there for conservation work, for sure. So I think we don't have any more in the Q&A, so I'm going to let my brain ramble here for a moment. But before I sort of share some thoughts and some questions for you, I want to thank you and for pointing out the Lights Out program specifically. I think the Eastern Whippoorwill and nightjars in general are a great example of two of the large programs that we focus on through OBCI, which is stopover ecology, with our Lights Out program, as well as forest management. And this bird really showcases the importance of this full annual cycle ecology and addressing those two concerns. We have salvaged, unfortunately, whippoorwills from our collision surveys in Lights Out Cleveland. So, we know that they're coming through Ohio cities, and those Lights Out efforts are really important. But I want to sort of pick your brain a little bit about forest and forest structure. I know that your work for your master's was really using the spatial data. So the question may or may not be answerable, but we know that all forests are not created equal. And if we look at the types of forests that whippoorwills use here in the breeding grounds, in a lot of Ohio, they use early successional habitat and mature forest together. It's sort of that matrix of open scrub habitat and forest. And we know in other parts of their range, they might use more open pine forest or savanna type forest that likely is maybe a little bit more reminiscent of some of the habitat that occurred in Ohio. Do you know what the structure is like in some of that forest that they're using during the overwintering period? Primary versus secondary forests are certainly going to be quite different in my experience, in some of the forests that I've been in Colombia and other parts of the tropics. But are they using sort of open understoried forests, or is it pretty dense? I'm thinking about their foraging ecology and the need to sort of fly around and catch moths and other nocturnal insects.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great point, Matt. And I think that was part of the surprise that, so many of these birds, not like over a third of them, only had forest in their home ranges, right? So that's kind of a direct contrast to what, as you were saying, how we tend to think of these birds on the breeding grounds, using kind of that combination of early successional habitat and then denser forest. And so unfortunately, with the satellite imagery, we didn't feel like super confident in classifying these different types of forests. I mean, you can kind of tell, like, if it's a very sparse or open forest, you can kind of, like, sometimes you can see the ground in between the forest. And also same with, like, if you have more coniferous trees that tend to be, if you're thinking Christmas trees or something, you might see the floor, the forest floor. Whereas if you have, deciduous trees that are, or broadleaf trees, with big canopies that are that have a closed canopy, you're not going to be able to tell it all. So I think, there's potentially more that could be done even with the satellite imagery, but especially with these small sample sizes, we did not break up the forest class any further than that. But yeah, I think that's like the next big question. At least the direct extension with my research would be, like, go down to the wintering grounds, try to go to some of these areas where we know a whippoorwill has a home range set up. We found that there's super high site fidelity between years, so we think we could actually go down to the same areas where they've set up home ranges in the past and try to get a better understanding of what's going on with their prey. We have no idea what whippoorwills are actually eating in the wintering grounds. We assume that they're eating flying insects and, predominantly moths and beetles like they do on the breeding grounds, but we have no real documentation of whippoorwill diet on the wintering grounds. So take some fecal samples if you could get that, or at least get an idea of what insects are around, and then try to get a better understanding of what those forests really look like. Because it seems like if they have the same foraging behavior, it seems like they would have to be using, open forest, or using tree fall gaps, or foraging above the canopy or something like that. So trying to understand kind of what that forest structure looks like, and what their behavior and diet is like on the wintering grounds.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really important follow-up, and hopefully we can find somebody who wants to do that, or maybe you and I can take a vacation someday and go check these birds out, because I think that really gets at the question, what is the potential value of secondary forest in a lot of these systems for, these neotropical migratory birds. We know species like cerulean warbler and other are using secondary forests quite a bit, depending on the landscape. So anyway, I'm ready for a trip whenever you are.
Let's do it. I should say some of the folks at the University of Illinois who collaborated on, with us at Ohio State, they're starting to do that as well. So we don't have to start from scratch. We can kind of build off of what they're doing as well. Mike Ward just got back from Mexico, and they're looking into some of these questions.
Cool. Well, I think that's all we have in the Q&A. So again, I just want to take an opportunity to thank you for joining us remotely, Aaron, and sharing this work with you. It's really cool. I'm glad everybody got to see it. And for those of you who couldn't join today and are watching this on YouTube, stay tuned for future programs. So thanks, everyone.